Hello, what's up guys? Muhammad Arham here. So, from many weeks, you guys must have been thinking that I have been ignoring you. However, I have been busy in my studies. It's all along IGCSE. So, it's a tough competition. So, today we are going to discuss that what happens after macOS Tahoe to the OpenCore Legacy Patcher. So, many of the people were thinking that OpenCore Legacy Patcher will manage to support macOS 27 build, even though it is not possible. I'm really sorry, guys, but I have to say because it's a truth. So we will discuss many of the reasons that why it's not possible. So that OpenCore Legacy Patcher is a sophisticated bootloader that depends upon Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, which also stands for UFI. So it requires a complex patching inside of the UEFI for the internal memory of the macOS. Like, as you already know that the Clover, as you know this, Clover was something that was very different. However, OpenCore Legacy Patcher became very different. The patcher was to improve the purpose of Clover bootloader. As you can see, OpenCore Legacy Patcher is a sophisticated bootloader used to inject and patch data in memory instead of a disk. This means we are able to achieve a near-native experience on many unsupported Macs. So these are currently macOS Sequoia is supported by OpenCore Legacy Patcher, and the latest release is OpenCore Legacy Patcher 2.4.0. So right now, OpenCore Legacy Patcher devs are trying to work day and night to support macOS 26 on all unsupported Macs, which will be starting from 2008 to the unsupported models that were dropped in macOS Tahoe. But we will discuss this in another video when OpenCore Legacy Patcher releases support for macOS Tahoe. So there are many key reasons that why OpenCore Legacy Patcher will not be able to support macOS 27 for Intel Macs. So basically, the difference between x86 and x84 and the ARM64 is about the boot system. So, as you already know, Intel based Macs require UEFI or EFI to boot macOS into the Macs, unsupported Mac. So, that was the reason that why we were able to install Bootcamp to boot Windows on your older Macs. That was very interesting feature. However, with Apple Silicon, Apple also removed this feature because we did not have any of the booting system on ARM64, which was similar to the booting system of Windows. So this is one of the reasons that why OpenCore Legacy Patcher will not be able to support macOS 27 on Intel Macs. Many of the people were thinking that we could use this technology relative to technology, which was a translator, which translates the Intel instruction of x86 x84. For example, you are using an app which was basically natively made for Rosetta 2, blah blah blah. For example, let's make it Arham's pH meter. It was written specifically for Intel Macs. However, if I want to support my app, which specifically runs on Intel's run it on ARM64, we need this Rosetta 2 technology. So the people thought that we could use this reverse formula to convert the ARM64 instructions back to Intel on x86, x84. So guys, that's not possible. Once x86, x84 compilers were removed from the software, it's not possible or really difficult to re-add those binaries back. And okay, leave all of that. x86, x84. The Apple Silicon have a very different booting system. It requires the use of bootloaders for booting any macOS or something. So Apple had already used iBoot. iBoot is a stage 2 bootloader for iPhone, iPads, and now it's even Apple Silicon based Macs. Although you could also use this on T2 chip, which is Intel based Macs, which starts by running code on the T2 chip from the boot ROM. And then the boot ROM loads and runs iBoot into the T2 chip. So I will give you the description below. Anyone who is interested to learn all of the science behind it, you can feel free to do it. Okay, so iBoot was a traditional iPhone and iPad bootloader, as you already know, that was also applied to Apple Silicon Macs once they transitioned to uh, Apple Silicon. So what's the real big reason why we will not be able to support macOS Sequoia, the macOS 27 on unsupported Intel Macs? So I don't mind. I don't actually know all science behind it, but I will try to explain you in a very well manner. So, for example, the CPU instruction set, ARM64 kernel and userland x84 and x86 kernel. So, for example, suppose if macOS 27 is compiled for ARM64 only, every kernel image and almost every userland binary will be ARM instructions. And as we already know, an x86 CPU cannot execute ARM instructions natively. So that was the reason why we were not able to enable Apple Intelligence on unsupported Intel Macs. So if, for example, suppose I made an app on Xcode which only runs for ARM64 instructions. So there is no way to run this app that is natively for Apple Silicon to run it on x86 or x64. Even okay, if the OpenCore Legacy Patcher devs were able to re-add macOS 27 support back to Intel's, but this will not be a software. Everything will be broken. You cannot basically add x86, x84, 64 kernel back. Okay, I will just rewrite back. But tell me one question. Why you were not able to ever run iOS 16 on iPhone 6s? Okay, like there was a tutorial how to install my iOS 16 on iPhone 6s. But these are the old fake videos that are circulated on social media. So the same thing will be applied to macOS 27 when it will be only restricted to ARM64 instructions. So the only solution to all of that is to use an Apple Silicon Mac. Okay, so basically, what's the main difference between um between 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 Intel Macs? So basically, for example, you are turning on MacBook Pro late 2013. I was talking about my model. Firmware or UEFI initializes hardware, as you already know. Option ROMs for some devices run. Firmware looks for a bootloader. which is known as boot.efi and VRM selection entry. On T2 Max, the T2 chip is a part of the chain that validates early stages. Okay, that's very interesting. So now what's about the Apple Silicon? Now, if you are turning on power, chip boot ROM fused on into SoC runs first. SoC is something very different for OpenCore, Apple Silicon Max. So what is SoC? We will just look it at the top. So what? Okay, I cannot find it. So let's search it on Google. So it's SoC basically this SoC is a system in a package, which basically only uses ARM64. So SoC is something very different. It can be it's like only used for OpenCore Legacy, so it can use for ARM64. So now LLB low level bootloader. So bootloader ROM selects load a signed LLB from internal storage and verifies cryptographically against on SoC keys. LLB performs further hardware in it and lowers the next stage. So if you really want to understand, let's see a magic. So you know about cryptography. Like if you study a chapter in computer science, it's all about blockchaining. So, for example, there are some ciphertext, like for example, cipher- or suppose I was basically having this is a MacBook, MacBook Pro, late 2013. So, who really knows what that mean? Unless they get access to a code, like a key for that. So basically, it says wake love the pedophiles or something is blah blah blah. It's looking like French or something. Oh my god, okay. It's very funny to read these things. So, for example, this is a cryptography LLB. Now, iBoot, as you already know, it's equivalent to Apple boot state. Now, SOC enforces a chain of strike. Every state must be cryptographically signed and approved by the chip's policy, local policy. So now this eliminates UEFI environment. Like it just throws it out. Like for example, you did something and your parents throw you out of the house. Say get out. So basically, ARM64 just simply set to UEFI by replacing it with iBoot and said get out. So this is basically very funny. Why Apple just changed everything. So SoC firmware verifies the OS and APFS snapshots SSV. So basically, ARM64 kernel has the Apple sign drivers. You cannot basically access these things. So many of the people thought that why we should not create a jailbreak for Macs. Oh my god, that's interesting. That's a very good idea. You can basically jailbreak your Macs and get Cydia, macOS version, and you can install the same cloning features of macOS 27 or macOS 26. So maybe in the nearby future you can get those features on Intel's by jailbreaking your own Mac. So that's all about feature. However, other than that, there was another thing that was known as can we run macOS 28 or macOS 29. For suppose macOS 28 to macOS 29 drops M1 from its support list. But I guess it's more easy for OpenCore Legacy Patcher to re-add those back because it's ARM64, so they can basically jailbreak. They can like there was I saw some videos on YouTube when the people were trying to run Windows on their through Apple Silicon Mac. So if you use that same concept, you can run macOS or Linux on your unsupported Apple Silicon laptops. So if you use that same site and try to run macOS 29 on unsupported Macs, that would be very interesting. So I hope OpenCore Legacy Patcher stays alive and makes a project for Apple Silicon. So in the nearby future, we could see supports for M series, but Intel Max that forever. So that is it. That is it. See you in the next video. Bye.